Hello, my name is Claude Buechner, and it's my honor to be the host today. We have a presentation by Ruben Nelson, and the title is Permacrisis, Polycrisis, Metacrisis, an attempt to clarify the human problematique. Just what should we expect? Confused and inadequate conceptualizations lead to wrong-headed understandings. Confused and wrong-headed understandings lead to well-intended prescriptions which often make things worse. Since our situation is worse today than when CACOR was formed, it is not unreasonable to explore whether we in modern techno-industrial, sometimes referred to as MTI, cultures have been operating on the basis of confused and inadequate conceptualization of the mess of living, the human problematique. It is time to get clear about the root sources and nature of our troubles. The intent is to do so in this presentation. A Canadian pioneer of serious futures thinking, Ruben Nelson, has spent his life exploring and seeking to understand the focus that we are now reshaping, that is now reshaping our lives, world, and future. His unique mental models and strategic insights transform and make sense of the confusion, anger, and turmoil of our perilous times. He has come to understand the personal to civilization transformation we are in. Today, he is Canada's leading researcher, practitioner, and teacher of Strategic Foresight 2.0, the next generation of strategic foresight and the new cognitive work of whole systems governance and leadership. Ruben, you have the floor.
Thank you, Claude. And thank all of you who are part of this and all who will watch this on video without a chance to participate. I'm delighted to be here. As noted, this is a probe into the nature of the human problematique that we are up against. It's appropriate that this be done in CACOR because that phrase, human problematique, is deeply associated with the Club of Rome. I'm going to start with a brief situation report. We're all familiar with it, but I find it useful to remind ourselves of just how deep the trouble is that we are in. I want to start with an insight from Langdon Gilkey, a theologian at University of Chicago. Human freedom in history never means the freedom to avoid the fundamental trends of an epoch. This picture has been developed by complexity scientists as one way to graphically capture the situation that we're in. That for the last 11,000 years as a species, we've been in the Holocene, and that basin to the left, remarkably conducive to human life and other life. And now our modern techno-industrial form of civilization is pushing us out of the Holocene into a yet unknown future. The assumption broadly is that we'll somehow end up in that green bowl. The people I pay most attention to are deeply worried that the odds are we'll end up in the red bowl in an unsafe future. And one of the reasons is caught here, a diagram done by Bob Horn, a colleague of mine, a wonderful American artist. And what he's trying to capture is that we live in a mess of complex living messes. That every one of those arrows, while it looks static on the screen, is actually a complex system. And it's changing, they're all changing in and of themselves, let alone with their interactions with each other. And as you begin to understand the degrees of complexity we're up against, it's extraordinary. Russ Ackoff at the Wharton School in the 1960s, this is a long time ago, but had this then profound insight that managers are not confronted with problems that are independent of each other, but with dynamic situations that consist of complex systems of changing problems that interact with each other. I call such situations messes. Managers do not solve problems, they manage messes. And I have added, senior leaders must govern the management of messes. And of course, as you look at the institutions in our culture, there's very little of that kind of governance going on. Ashby's law of requisite variety, when applied to governance, in effect says, in order to govern effectively, your governing system has to be at least as complex as that which you're governing. Given the complexity that we now face, there isn't a ghost of a chance. There's no church, there's no university, there's no government department, no corporation. There is no example today of a large organization that meets Ashby's law of requisite variety. So there's no surprises that we're in trouble. Yehezkel Dror said in a report to the Club of Rome in 2001, the situation of humanity in the face of global transformations can be summarized in 2 sentences. Societies are unprepared. Governance is unequipped. In the main, contemporary governance is obsolete and unable to deal fittingly with rapidly mutating problems and opportunities. And now libertarian populism, whether in the form of what we're seeing in Canada or the United States or in other places, it reduces democracy to give the people what they want. That if there's a majority of people who want something, they've got the votes. So democracy means you give them what they want. Another clue, it was a clue to our future. Now it seems to me an observation on our present. Thomas Homer Dixon, the founder of the Cascade Institute, and I'm pleased to say a friend and colleague, in his commanding hope, humanity is no longer moving towards a future anymore that will allow our communities, locally, nationally, or globally, to flourish together. If we're moving anywhere at all, we seem to be sliding down a slippery slope towards a treacherous place with unreason, self-righteous anger, and racism greasing our shared descent. What does all of this portend? As the century unfolds, fear is likely to become humanity's overriding emotion. 2019, a report on Davos. Davos elites fear they're on a toboggan ride to hell. The global winners here in Switzerland aren't so sure that they're up to the task of running the world anymore. These alleged masters of the universe came off nearly as perplexed and anxious about the future as the populist forces inveighing against them. 2003, the Rand Corporation. Our world confronts rapidly and potentially profound transitions. It is increasingly clear that today's decisions could play a decisive role in determining whether the 21st century offers peace and prosperity or crisis and collapse. And I suggest to you that when that was said in the 2003, that people read it and kind of nodded and said, yeah, that sounds kind of wise, but fundamentally we ignored it. That very few governments made serious attempts in any field to prepare themselves for a future that they had not anticipated previously. Now, 21 years later, it's absolutely clear that the prospects for crisis and collapse are far more serious than we gave them a chance for. And one of the things Bill Reese talks about, we have to learn to play by the rules of the Earth's game. That the Earth sets the condition, offers clues, it's only clues as to what the game is and what the rules are, and the Earth is the referee. That if the Earth decides you get turfed out of the game, you cannot appeal that. All persons' communities are embedded in cultures which exemplify a form of civilization which construes reality. And the rules are that we must not construe reality and respond to it, that we must not destroy the Earth's living ecology by either consumption or pollution to the point it cannot support us and other living life forms. We mustn't consume non-renewable resources to the point where diminishing returns entail the collapse. That is the simplification of the biosphere, our economy, or our cultures. We must be humane enough to keep us in the game And we must honor these conditions and be humane enough to keep the game going. And my work and research over my lifetime, I've come to the conclusion that modern techno-industrial form of civilization cannot, it's not that we are not or that we will not, it's that we cannot meet these conditions. And I'll say more about that later. Here's Bob Horn again, that this map drawn by our modern techno-industrial world is not working in a world of living complex messes. So what are we up against? Well, I'm going to give you an overview. Here's a chart that I'll fill in a minute. You can see an increasing curve, and the x-axis is the decreasing fit of our situation with the modern techno-industrial sense of reality and our mental maps and models. That is, the further you go to the right-hand side of that chart, the less effective our modern techno-industrial mental models are in making sense of reality. And the y-axis is increasing complexity and speed of change. So ideally, where you want to be is somewhere down in the bottom left corner, where life is fairly simple, where our models map onto reality, and where change is slow enough that, in fact, as it happens, we can comprehend it and adapt to it. And at different stages, you get a different sense in the society as to what they're up against. So down in that corner where things work, folks feel they're up against solvable, separate crises that only happen occasionally, and we're basically good to go. That yes, occasionally we're a bit overwhelmed, but we can find ways to sleep it off or win a war and get back to normal. As things get worse, people find that there are multiple solvable crises, that still that belief that everything's a problem, problems can be solved. In the 1980s, Willis Harman wrote a lovely article about the crisis of crises, the nightmare of every general that they're fighting a three-front war, which every general knows is virtually impossible and that you're going to lose. So this is a situation where life is much more difficult, but you've still got that sense that if we run very hard, like Alice's Red Queen, we can keep up with it. As you move on, you face a cultural permacrisis. You're now in a cultural condition of permanent crisis. There's no getting out of this. There's no afterwards, because one crisis piles on another so much. And then beyond that, you're into a world of cascading polycrises caused by inappropriate worldviews. And that's where our mental models stop in terms of the modern world. And if you get into a civilizational metacrisis, you find that it literally is not possible to make sense of it with a modern techno-industrial understanding of reality. So God knows we don't want to go there. These numbers are just there to give you some impression. I don't know any research that would defend them. I don't want to defend them other than just in principle. I want to say that it seems to me there's still a critical mass of people, a significant number of citizens in modern cultures who still fantasize that they're in a simple world, who keep saying, keep it simple, stupid, who keep saying, reduce taxes, simplify government, just have common sense, and that all problems are solvable and we'll be fine. These people are not insignificant. They are often running countries or hoping to do so. Most folks, I think, have come to the place where regrettably they realize that with Willis Harman, we're in a crisis of crises. We've got multiple solvable problems going on at the same time, that governments and others have to make choices, that you may have to wait in line, but damn it, it's really difficult. There's a small number of people who understand that we're actually beyond that point, facing a cultural permacrisis. A much smaller number of people talking about a worldview, Polycrisis. And such a small number, if you don't like 0.01%, add as many zeros as you want. To all intents and purposes, the thought that we face a civilizational meta-challenge is an unknown unknown. There's no talk about it in the literature. There's nobody organized for it. There's no university group thinking about it. It's simply beyond our imagination. So that's the overview. What are we up against? Well, the first thing we're up against is our formation as MTI cultures. We are all modern techno-industrial persons living in MTI cultures in an MTI world. We're not a majority of the world, but we have the most power and the most money, and we've been able to talk other people into the belief, true or not, that we are the future and they should become like us, and they should let us design modern techno-industrial institutions to run the world. And we've gotten away with that so far. It's not working as well today as it did 20 years ago, let alone 60, but it's still working. And we have a mantra, a belief system about ourselves that is so deep and so thick that we actually believe it. It is reinforced with literally thousands of messages every day. That as a species, we who are Homo sapiens have faced many profound challenges and a handful of existential threats over our 350,000-year-long journey. Before we became modern, we were at great risk because we could not tease out the real objective truth about the Earth, other species, or ourselves from our inherited cultural traditions, myths, superstitions, prejudices, from our theological suppositions, from village gossip. Nor could we protect those we love from the ravages of weather and disease. However, now that we have the science of the First Enlightenment, we can wrestle truth to the ground and own it. With the technologies that science enables, we can also own the Earth. Our successes over the last 500 years make this clear. Happily today, we who are MTI peoples and cultures know what needs to be done and have or will soon have the capacities, human and technological, to do it. Therefore, our core work in the 21st century is to find the leadership, political will, science-based technologies, and money, which will enable us to extend our MTI ways of being and living to and even beyond the ends of the Earth. And as we do so, we'll create a future which is more just, equitable, and inclusive. And I point out to you that 1% of global GDP is about 100 trillion, 1% of that, namely 1 trillion, is spent on advertising worldwide, most of which is designed to reinforce the truth of this mantra. So the second thing we're up against is cultural lag. That the stories we tell ourselves, remember those stories we tell ourselves are that mantra. It's what is sold by every university, every government, every chamber of commerce, every corporate leader, most churches. And so we lag behind reality. That our experience is it's one damn thing after another, and now there are more of them. We run faster to keep up, and we keep telling ourselves that we can do it, but we are getting tired and worried. And of course, the things that are happening are problems. Listen to our own culture. You cannot get through a day without hearing dozens of people talk about the situations we're in the language of problems and solution, in the language of fixing things. That belief that we can make things livable and fixable, and if we just trust our modern instincts enough and get complainers out of the way, we'll be fine. So here in May, a Global Solutions Summit was held. I didn't make this up. You can go to their webpage, globalsolutionsinitiative.org. We're going to get beyond the crisis is the promise. We'll mobilize change for global prosperity. That is sold in every election campaign in the OECD world. And of course, we know about modernity, that in a modern world, it's what First Enlightenment science taught us to do, that you break things down into their constituent parts, and those things into their constituent parts, and those things into their constituent parts. And to borrow an old Hindu story, it's constituent parts all the way down. And so you can only get a degree in a constituent part. There's no degrees in wholeness. So here's a diagram of our fixation on carbon emissions without any sense of context. And Tom Murphy, who does the blog on Do the Math, points out that our cultural tendency is to focus on one detail at a time by deliberately removing messy contextual links so that we may scrutinize the internal logic of each piece in isolation. And he says, but guess what? The actual real biophysical world we live in does not operate as tidy, isolated, non-interacting domains, rendering invalid many of our analysis efforts, however elegant. But our leaders in every sector keep promising us that they will solve our specific problems, and we as citizens keep asking them to solve our specific problems. If you listen to any election, what leaders are asked is, here's my problem, will you solve it if I vote for you? That's a serious situation to be in. Well, now we can up the ante. A permacrisis. Collins Dictionary Word of the Year just 18 months ago. Their definition is an extended period of instability or insecurity, especially one resulting from a series of catastrophic events. Permacrisis is a term that perfectly embodies the dizzying sense of lurching from one unprecedented event to another, as we wonder bleakly what new horrors might be just around the corner. Here, Neil Turnbull, in an article 18 months ago, permacrisis implies that we now see our crisis as situations that can only be managed, not resolved. Indeed, permacrisis suggests that every decision to accelerate a difficult situation in order to come out of the other side of it risks something far worse. Permacrisis signals not only a loss of faith in progress, but also a new realism in relation to what people can cope with and achieve. Our crises have become so complex and deep-seated that they can transcend our capacity to understand them. Any decision to tackle them only risks making things worse. Thus, we are faced with the troubling conclusion: our crises are no longer a problem, they are a stubborn fact. So here's an understanding of permacrisis that is verging on seeing it as a polycrisis. And again, our leaders in every sector keep promising us, just listen to the news, listen to what's going on. And you see that what I'm trying to do is tell you the actual mythic story that we live within. It's not something I've made up. And so polycrisis is now the word of the day among the most advanced researchers who worry about the fate of humanity. The debate around polycrisis is largely a question of whether we really understand the mess we're in. And of course, that's the whole point of this conversation today. Do we, with the concepts that we use, even the concept of polycrisis, is it adequate to understand the mess we're in? Because if not, we're hooped. Because as human beings, as human cultures, we respond to reality according to the ways we understand reality. So responses are a function of our understanding, and when our understanding is inadequate, our responses are bound to be inadequate. So here the Cascade Institute asks, is our predicament so unprecedented that we need a new perspective on the crisis? Second question, we won't establish concepts suffice? Third question, is more research really necessary for us to act effectively? to which they answer yes, no, and yes to those three questions. Neil Turnbull talks about the origins of this, that in his 2008 book on complexity, the French author Edgar Morin argues that humanity now resides within a network of interlocking systems, and any crisis in one of those systems will engender a crisis in all the others. Morin uses the word polycrisis to describe the situation. It's an idea that is also used in historian Alec Touza's work on crisis and disaster. As Touze recently put it, when considering the sheer accumulation of problems around the world, from conflict and the climate crisis to the pandemic and rising inflation, quote, the whole is even more dangerous than the sum of the parts. Interconnected microsystems, because of ever-shortening positive feedback loops, can very easily trigger crises, even catastrophe, in the wider microsystem. So that you're beginning to see here that to understand polycrisis, you also have to have a non-trivial understanding of complexity theory. And remember that advanced complexity theory takes you beyond our modern techno-industrial way of thinking. Complexity theory started with modern techno-industrial thinking. And there's a lot of complex things can be understood within a modern framework. But complexity theorists are in the process of discovering that as they pursue complexity theory into living complex systems, that modernity will no longer do it. They're not yet, they're just barely becoming reflexive enough to observe that that's the fact. Trust me, in the next 10 years, that will be a major conversation, because that's a whole new conversation. Because up to now, we've just taken for granted that we who are modern, that the ways we think about the world can be improved enough that we're good to go. Here you see from the Cascade Institute, experts know a lot about individual systemic risks, such as pandemics, and the vulnerabilities of particular global systems, such as finance or food. But our understanding of interactions between systems and their crises remain weak and undeveloped. Epidemiologists warned us that a major epidemic would be coming, for example. But who could predict that the government's response would interact with political polarization, misinformation, the radicalization to produce a freedom convoy that brought swastika flags to Ottawa? And we've yet to witness the full macroeconomic fallout of fiscal stimulus as high inflation interacts with energy shocks and supply chain disruptions. So we're back very much into complexity theory. And of course, the Cascade Institute was founded by Thomas Homer Dixon, who is one of Canada's premier complexity theorists. The proposed definition the Cascade Institute offers of a polycrisis is a global polycrisis occurs when crises in multiple global systems become causally entangled in ways that significantly degrade humanity's prospects. These interacting crises produce harms greater than the sum of those crises would produce in isolation, where the host systems not so deeply interconnected. In other words, they're talking about emergence of phenomenon that's more than the sum of the parts, a critical concept in complexity. So now I want to take us beyond modernity to a metacrisis. And of course, it's not surprising that a metacrisis, the talk of a metacrisis, is very recent. It's only a few years, if you even look at the oldest references, and it's occurring within modern techno-industrial cultures by modern techno-industrial people who don't yet have a clear sense that they may need to move beyond modern techno-industrial perceptions of reality to make sense of a metacrisis. So let's just go back to meta. It's a Greek word, and it has great subtlety, the meaning of which is determined by the context in which it is used. Now, the Greeks were systems thinkers, so they're used to the fact that you can't ask, what does that mean, without understanding the context. So to ask, what meta really means, apart from a specific context, shows that you don't understand how language works. You don't understand hermeneutics. So meta can be used to refer to that which is beside, literally quite physically. So Aristotle's metaphysics, he may have labeled it metaphysics simply as the volume he was working on that he put beside, literally on his shelf physically, beside the book on physics. Because we know he wrote a book on physics, he also wrote on metaphysics. And so he may have meant by metaphysics nothing more than, for himself, this is the one beside the other. Or it might have meant something above, which can mean literally that you stack one on top of the other. But above also has a kind of transcendent sense that you're focusing a higher level of generality. So in the old phrase, as above, so below, which you see caught in the symbolism of Israel on the Israeli flag, that's transcending to a new level of perception. Beyond has the same thing, that meta can mean beyond in the physical sense, that's literally beyond something, or it can mean a higher level of generality. Or it can mean after, in the sense that you get married, and after that, if you're my gender, you work on the project with prodding from your wife of becoming a married man. And that's a meta project. Trust me, becoming a married man, if you think, as Tiger Woods did, that becoming a married man is just being a better version of being single but with spouse, your marriage will not last. So meta depends on context, but of course, remember the modern world doesn't do context. And so, as Nora Bateson said in a lovely conversation, our modern world is a context that is allergic to contexts. We like to think of things separate in themselves. So the definition of metacrises that are offered to date, one is a crisis of crises. I've suggested this won't do. Willis talked about that in the 80s, and he wasn't talking about, in any important sense, a metacrisis. Daniel Thorson, multiple overlapping interconnected global crises that our nascent planetary culture faces. We've got a better word for that. It's a polycrisis. We don't need to extend that to a metacrisis and just confuse ourselves. Or David Payton essentially does the same thing. He says it's a single phenomenon that includes everything, but it's more than just that. It's emergence. And if he was better read in the literature of Polycrisis, he would say he might say we don't need metacrisis. So what you've got here are people using a language that doesn't add anything cognitively to what Polycrisis is already doing. And so they're just cluttering up the landscape. And so I want to say, if that's all that metacrisis amounts to, crap, let's stay with Polycrisis and join the Cascade Institute and its efforts to think clearly about these things. But there are some clues here that are hard to ignore, that there's something here that's hard to grasp with our MTI minds that may be more than just a polycrisis. And it somehow includes everything that's overarching or undergirding. It's not just more of what we already have. It's not just additive. There's emergence. It's sui generis. It's something in its own right that we haven't seen before. And it may need a new conception, a fresh imagination. So if we follow that, maybe we should say we don't face a metacrisis, that the language of metacrisis misuses the use of meta, applying it to crisis. That what we face is a meta challenge, not a metacrisis, and that it's personal to civilizational in scope. Now, a meta challenge is different from a crisis in that a crisis is literally something that comes and goes. Now, a crisis in your healthcare, the way it goes can be your death. but there is an end to it. I mean, the whole notion of crisis is not that it goes on forever. Crises may go on forever, that they keep new ones being added. But a challenge may be a challenge, not just, it may be for a week, it may be for your lifetime, it may be for a generation, it may be for a challenge for a whole culture over multiple generations. So a meta challenge is then something that this is interesting because we don't think this way. Even the Club of Rome, God bless it, doesn't think this way. Its whole literature on transformation misses this point. It doesn't understand that yet. And I know I've said something rude, but I'm not worried about being invited to be a member. If they wanted me to be a member, they would have invited me years ago. So here's where we, in modern cultures, think we are in history. We're partway up a growth curve. And we're good at making economic growth work. We know that economic growth is necessary and possible. We think we can extend it virtually forever. We can improve and extend MTI cultures. That arrow is going up as our future. Innovation will be within the MTI frames of reference. Given the speediness of our world, don't worry about thinking deeply. Speed beats death. Get something to the market. Try stuff out. And MTI can solve and fix all problems. That's where we are. That's a visual. And if you're interested, I've written a piece on this that's been published. This is where we actually are. We're not where we think we are in history. Remember, we suffer from cultural lag. So the images in our head about where we think we are in history and where we really are in history are a mismatch. And with every passing decade, that space is getting larger. Modernity is lagging further and further behind what's actually happening in the modern world and with people who are not yet modern. And that yellow fulcrum indicates the peak of modernity. We're past peak modernity. We're into its decline and disintegration. There's not a damn thing we can do about that any more than any Caesar could stop the disintegration of the Western Empire in Rome after about the time of Jesus. We're in ecological overshoot. Thank you, Bill Reese. We're also in civilizational overshoot, a concept I coined some years ago. More and better MTI turns out to be lethal. It's pouring fuel on the fire. Our future is essentially one of the disintegration of MTI. It will become, and I use that language, think of having an old Shetland sweater, a sweater made on the Shetland Islands in Scotland. It was so thick and so heavy that it was waterproof. You didn't need a rain jacket. You could take it out in the rain, it would keep you warm, and it got wet, but the inside was waterproof. But over the years, as it disintegrated, it doesn't mean it falls apart in your hands, still keeps you warm, but some of the wind can get through now and some of the water can get through as it's not as tightly knit as it used to be. And that's what we're into. It's not some kind of overwhelming collapse. It's just that bits don't fit together the way they used to. Everything takes more time, energy, and money. And it turns out that we're kind of more and more behind the eight ball. So this is a P to C meta challenge that we face. That's personal to civilization. This means it's at every scale that people who talk about the need for personal transformation are not wrong. But it's incomplete if they're not also saying this is about a personal changes that fit within the kind of changes at every scale, from family to neighborhood to our whole form of civilization. And it's changes at those large levels that fit our personal changes. Well, at the moment, this is not anybody's project. There are people with transformational projects at every stage along that way, but there's nobody yet who's talking about a global P2C meta-challenge to become reflexively and even meta-reflexively conscious enough to learn and understand that reality is construable. Now, to say that challenges one of the most fundamental, holiest of holy statements of First Enlightenment science, that reality is objective and out there whether we like it or not. Writ large, reality is construable. If that's the case, we need to understand the dimensions, drivers, dynamics, depths, and drifts that are entailed in the emergence of the forms of civilization that have emerged to date. That is to say, we as human beings have construed reality into 3 forms of civilization. That's already been done. That's historic fact. We need to understand how and why the MTI form of civilization is fatally flawed, because otherwise we'll just keep repeating the mistakes. We need to understand what's entailed in learning to outgrow and mature beyond our formation as MTI persons and institutions and in MTI cultures. Now, if you understand that, that's implying that we have to put human character back into every possible human activity, from making love to being a husband to raising children to giving birth to being educated. Now, I'm old enough that when I went to university, I was not yet legally an adult, so universities had to care about my character formation, because otherwise they could be sued by my parents or guardian, because I wasn't yet 21. Now we've changed the age of 21 and we've become more secular, so you can get a degree in anything, including theology, and no one will talk to you about your character unless it's egregious. The University of Calgary Law faculty have even written to the Alberta Law Society to say, don't be confused that we've given all these people university degrees. This says nothing about the quality of their character as to whether they should be admitted as benchers to the bar in Alberta. It's your problem to figure out character. We're not in that business anymore. And then we wonder why the culture disintegrates. As we seek to mitigate the worst of the collapse of our culture and nurture the next form of civilization into being. So a word of caution, the MTI take on reality is sufficiently flawed that it cannot nurture a reliable sense of the earth or life on earth, including that of humans and other persons. The key is that MTI cannot require that reflexivity is a routine practice of persons and cultures. And it turns out that to make sense of the times we're in and cope with it at all, we have to learn to be reflexive. And so a core insight in this work is that MTI is unreflexively reality blind. And as Louise Penny, a lovely Canadian author, said in her book, The Kingdom of the Blind, nothing ever good came out of a blind spot. MTI requires us to be logical, empirical, rational, and even critical. You hear those 4 virtues, celebrated in CACOR a lot. It does not and cannot ask us to be reflexive. There's good arguments for that, but I'll leave them aside for now. A further word of caution. As yet, no culture has developed the capacity to work competently and consistently and meta-reflexively at the foundational level of its culture and form of civilization. Therefore, none as yet is able to illuminate, inform, and reframe the policy and operational issues with which it wrestles in light of a sound understanding of its profoundly changing lives and circumstances. What I'm saying is that all our elegant policy analysis and what passes as deep thinking about the future, if you look at it, in 99.99999% of the cases, you will find, if you scratch deep enough, it presupposes a modern techno-industrial understanding of reality, and therefore a modern techno-understanding response to reality. And what the meta challenge that we face is that a modern techno-industrial understanding of reality is no longer adequate. Our challenge is to become a leading, learning, living laboratory for the development of a whole culture that's truly aligned with the deep character of the 21st century, one that's committed to learning how to cooperate with our own evolution beyond our MTI identities as persons, families, communities, companies, and jurisdictions as we learn to embody a new form of civilization. So I just want to take a few minutes to do a quick refresher on the understanding of reality that's behind this, otherwise this won't make sense. That the epistemology I've come to understand, that has to do with the understanding of the nature of reality, is that we live in a reality that in its totality is construable. There are individual bits. Some of the individual bits in that reality are what we call objectively real. They don't change. But reality writ large is construable. It runs from the bloody obvious to the blindingly obvious, and it's not an accident that both those phrases have emerged in English. What's more, human beings have construed reality into three different forms of civilization. So a form of civilization is a new concept, also written as civilization subscript F, and that all human cultures exemplify a form of civilization. So this new concept is a new idea. I've suggested earlier that we may be in a position that the concepts that we work with in modernity may not be adequate to let us make sense. That in our modern world, we can talk of human civilization in the singular. We do that. There's literature there. That means the whole of mankind, of humankind at any given time. And to move down to the third level, we talk of many human cultures or societies. We even talk of, in the plural, human civilizations, which are simply cultures that we particularly admire. So ancient Greece is also talked of as a civilization, but ancient Iceland isn't. So if you're a really good culture, but talking of ancient civilizations doesn't get you to the level that's at the general level if you use the taxonomy of biology. So we've got family, we've got species and subspecies, but in our literature, we're missing something at the general level, and I fill that in with the concept of form of civilization. So that a form of civilization has the same status to a particular civilization that vegetable has to potato. Potato is an exemplar of a vegetable. And any given culture at any given time in history is an exemplar of a form of civilization. And so I've said that reality can be construed in three different ways, and it has been. There may be other ways we haven't figured out yet, but so far in history, we've got these three: Indigenous, settled agriculture, and modern techno-industrial. And each is separate and discrete in the sense that the cultures, these are the smiley faces, there's different cultures within them, so that Indigenous people know that as a form of civilization, they are more like each other than any of them are like settled agriculture or modern cultures. But they also know they're hugely different. They keep saying to us, hey, white man, hey, stupid, being Indigenous is not a culture. We're not all like each other. Our cultures are as different as modern cultures are different from each other. And we don't have a way of thinking about that. We do now with this concept of a form of civilization. If indigeneity gives you a form of civilization, then within that you can have a host of different ways of being indigenous. The same is true once the Holocene happens and you get settled agriculture, or more recently, modern agriculture. And at the heart of each of these is a core paradigm which defines the culture. In other words, there has to be a way of telling them apart, and the core paradigm is the bit in red. It's understanding the nature of reality, that's ontology, the nature and agency of human persons, who we are as persons, and our relationship to reality, what we can do to reality and what reality can do to us. And if you understand then that a form of civilization, this is where the differences are. You want to understand how I'm different from my indigenous cousins who literally are just down the road from me as the Inari Nakota. It's that they experience reality in a different way. They experience themselves in reality in a different way, and that relationship is different. If I use the phrase that they use, all my relations, there's not a chance, no ghost of a chance, that I can use it in the way they do. And so we've got these three forms of religion. This is, in a sense, normal sociology and anthropology, that 350,000 years ago, we Homo sapiens began to separate from other hominins. And for most of that time, up until 12,000 years ago or so, many different cultures, but only one form of civilization, namely small group nomadic. With the Holocene, warming of the earth, agriculture becomes possible. You get 4,000 or 5,000 years. That local settled agriculture isn't a clear model. There's lots of messiness in there, which we're beginning to appreciate. And by the way, this is not a model that local agriculture is better than small group. In fact, small group nomadic cultures handle living complex systems better than the other two do. When it comes to who is the better master of living, actually living in a complex living world, small groups do it hands down. We don't know that, of course, because we tend to see them as primitive. Most recently, in the last 1,000 years, our modern techno-industrial cultures have emerged, and the mythology is that they'll all become like us. And as I'm saying, there's not a ghost of a chance that that's going to happen. So what I've tried to do is to say, what are we up against? We're up against, at the deepest level, the limits of our own belief as modern people, as cultures, and our own belief in that belief. Because we don't know that the way what we believe about reality and persons is not adequate enough. It doesn't deserve a future, and it's not going to have one. And that doesn't mean that we just all have to die in a mess. It means the challenge is to grow up. It's like a spouse in early days saying, "Hey, Butch, why is it that only my hands are in the diaper pail?" Now, unless you're really thick-headed, you're being given a message about your behavior, but not just about your behavior, but about the very way you conceptualize gender roles and your relationship to your wife and all kinds of things. And it's part of saying to yourself, "Oh yeah, stupid, I'm now married, and part of being married is learning to rework my imagination as to what that is and what it means." So 2 closing comments. General David Petraeus has written a wonderful thick book called Conflict, The Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Ukraine. Took me months to read it, but I commend it to you. It's extraordinary. And in his introduction, he says this: leaders must be able to master 4 major tasks. First, the implication being, if you don't get the first one right, forget about the others. They need comprehensively to grasp the overall strategic situation in a conflict and craft the appropriate strategic approach. In essence, to get the big ideas right. And what I'm suggesting we're up against is a culture that is proud of itself, that does not get the big ideas right about itself or its future, and doesn't yet know it. and that's the biggest risk that we face. Or you can turn to philosophy, which is part of my training. John McMurray was the head of the philosophy department at Edinburgh. He was invited in 1949 to Queen's University in Kingston by the then head of the department, Sandy Duncan, who had been his student in Edinburgh before the war. And Sandy was my chief of philosophy. And in his lecture, The Conditions of Freedom, McMurray said, to be rid of illusions, if it does not break our courage, and that's an extraordinary qualification, that being rid of the illusions that we who are modern suffer from may be more than we are up to. We think we're up for everything, but in fact, we may break before we change enough to survive. But if it does not break our courage, it's a liberating experience. And it's in the service of that liberation that I have tried to live my life and speak to you today. Over to you. Our future is in our hands, minds, hearts, and spirits. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruben. And now we're going to move into our Q&A. Mike Nickerson left. He made a comment, not really a question. And if we have time, we might go back to that.
I'm actually here, Claude.
Oh, good.
We got cut off a couple of times.
Okay, very good. Yeah, I did too once, and I lost some of the chat, so we'll deal with that. So I was about to use my prerogative for the first question, and then Mike, you will be on deck. I'm not. You gave a lot, Ruben, for us to think about, and during part of that, I was thinking about what Marshall McLuhan said about the object in the field, and it almost feels like what we're faced with is that the field itself is what seems to be unraveling. In other words, the ability of the field to guarantee us for 8 billion people enough drinkable water or enough food, let alone the accoutrements of modern living, which we'll probably not have to deal with as things progress. So can you make a comment about that, Ruben? Is that, am I misreading what you're trying to say? You're muted.
Thank you, Claude. Interesting that you turn to that metaphor. You may well know that there used to be a quarterly called Fields Within Fields. It's still out there on the web. I commend it to you. It's no longer published, but it's among the earliest attempts of people who were onto this, that as human beings, there's two fields that we absolutely depend on, that if they disintegrate, we die. One that you've mentioned, and that's the field that Bill Reese spends most of his time thinking about, and that's our ecological field, the biosphere that we live within. If we do enough damage to it, it finally says to us, I can get by with less, you can't. You know, how many people, take an average city, how many people in Calgary, which is my city, have any idea of what percentage of oxygen has to be in the air before they die? If there's either too much or too little, and the range is 18 to 22 or 23%. And the Earth has lived with 0, the Earth has lived with 100%. So the Earth says, I can cope with the whole range. You can't. So if you're not up to these changes, it's your problem. So that biological field is absolutely clear. It's where most of our work is. It's what most of the Club of Rome spend its time on. What I'm trying to say is there's another field, and that's the form of civilization. And since that's a new concept, don't expect people to understand that they actually depend on the form of civilization being adequate enough to actually support the way they live, not just through their own lifetime, but over hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of years. we now depend on two fields. We are in the process of both of them are disintegrating, and we don't understand either of those facts. So thank you. You have just reduced to what could be a billboard, and I thank you for it. I will use it. You've reduced an hour to a billboard. What was Ruben trying to say? You got it. Thank
you. And thank you too for that answer. Okay, let's see. Dave Doherty is on deck, and Mike, you have the floor.
Okay, well, thank you, Claude, and thank you, Ruben. It's good to refresh your perspective on the world. Clearly, we've got issues to deal with, and the more people that are aware of it and trying to deal with it, of course, the more likely we are to come out better on the end. Given that the population has a relatively short attention span, I'm wondering what are the fewest words that you could express the problem and possible solutions in?
Well, there's no solution. To treat it as a problem to be solved is to misunderstand. And so I forget which scientist who said to something, his response was, it's not even wrong. And I don't mean it nastily, Mike, we know each other and respect each other, but I really want to be clear. We are not in a problem that can be solved. We are in a situation that needs to be understood, that in order to even understand it, the prices we have to pay are that we learn to give up our identity as successful modern techno-industrial people, and we're willing to give up our identity as a modern techno-industrial culture. That's the project we're committed to. It's analogous to becoming married and being committed to the project of becoming a married man. In my case, as Heather would tell you, it took decades. Happily, it doesn't take 3 lifetimes. But what I'm saying is that we're up against something that as yet we do not understand. And therefore, the first task, if it is the case that our response to situation is a function of the way we understand it, our first task is to literally begin the project of saying, how do we learn to see that we're in such a situation that with our modern minds and logic and categories, we can't even understand it? I mean, this is like culture shock. We're both old enough to remember a world before CUSO, Canadian university students overseas, where in the 60s, some of our university students began to go to Nigeria and India, and they came back with culture shock because nobody had prepared them for the sense that they kind of vaguely knew that there were different cultures and whatnot. But of course, in Nigeria, you're in what I now characterize as a different form of civilization. And they had simply been told it's a different culture. And therefore, were unprepared for the depth of that difference in the same way Heather and I were unprepared, went to India 60 years ago. So I don't mean it. So that's where we have to start. That's the
short message to anybody that we find that's interested in the situation is to try to grasp the ungraspable.
It's not ungraspable. It's only ungraspable with the mind you have. Think of that person who, and I keep forgetting his name, which is just as well, the Hollywood producer who used to bed women so routinely he just took advantage of them until one of them said, and took him to court, he's now in jail. Yeah. And the point is, for him to understand why he's in jail, he needs to change his consciousness, his understanding of what it is to be a man and a woman and human respect. As long as he lives within the same consciousness that gets him in jail, he'll never understand why he's there. He will live every day thinking injustice has been done because he lived in a way that for him and his crowd was perfectly normal. So I'm saying this is a change that is so deep, and tragically, our universities have given up on this because it has something to do, it maps onto character development. Any good psychologist will tell you this. The trouble is, we don't even, you can become a psychologist today without any concern about your character. Therefore, about your insight.
Yeah, as you know, I would tip people towards thinking about this with the koan of more fun, less stuff, because that challenges materialism and suggests more spiritual base. But we have a long way to go before that catches on.
It will. Enough said. Thank you. God bless.
Okay, thank you. And I got the Daves out of order, and the chat has allowed me to correct that mistake. David Pollock, could you give us your question or comment? And then Dave Doherty is on deck.
Good. Hi, Ruben. Thanks for the presentation. I mean this question with the utmost respect, because I recognize what you're presenting is the result of many, many years of thinking about these questions. But I know you as a reflective or reflexive person, and I know Bill Reese as a thoughtful man. And it seems that to some extent, both of you have gotten out of the boxes that the MTI culture would suggest that we're locked into. And so I asked the question about what kind of evidence might need to be presented to you for you to begin to think that perhaps you have been wrong. Let us imagine, for example, a group of people that might include yourself and some Indigenous people and maybe some bright systems thinkers who are presented with the evidence where they're all convinced that in fact there has been overshoot and we need to reverse overshoot, and we don't need to emphasize growth any longer, but we've got to find steady state or even degrowth for some aspects of the economy. And that they pick up that challenge as a collective and they work on that task, but they're all individuals who have been born inside this MTI culture, which you argue is doomed. And so I'm not yet sure that there's not some leakage in your closed system of confidence that we are doomed, and that perhaps it's possible to have groupings of people who are systems thinker to not just focus on climate change, but to focus on things like boundary limits with the 9 limits. So my question is sort of twofold. One is, do you think some of that kind of thinking and grouping is possible? And have you considered yourself what sort of evidence you would need to help you think, well, gosh, maybe I'm wrong in my assessments here? Ruben.
Well, just as a preliminary comment, these, back to a question that was asked of what's his name, who first wrote about paradigms, he saw them as incommensurate. They're not, they overlap. If you go back, I won't show the screen, if you go back to the 3 images, you'll see they were color-coded, and Indigenous, one of the colors of Indigenous and one of the colors of small group are the same color that they share. They're both systems thinkers. And one of the colors in the agriculture and one of the colors in modern are the same. We are both people who think that reality is static and ahistorical, that the truly true and the really real. So these systems are not so utterly incommensurate. There isn't some truck and trade. If that weren't true, my own evolution wouldn't be possible. In other words, my own evolution and the evolution of all kinds of other people is evidence that complexity theory, as it talks about emergence of something new happening, is in fact important. Now that concept takes you beyond modernity. So what I would have to rethink, because the challenge you're asking me is what evidence would I need to think that that modernity could actually be adequate? And I'm sorry, there's too much evidence that it isn't adequate. Complexity theory and the fact of emergence. Scientists today routinely talk about emergence. You cannot deal with emergence within classic modern techno-industrial. We're already in the process of outgrowing it. So to frame it as, what do I have to do to be wrong? I mean, I can think about that, but it misses the point. It misses all the data that in my lifetime, biologists, for example, who when I was at university talked about master genes and had a mechanical model of the expression from a gene to a protein. One gene, one protein with master genes. Nice mechanical model. Nobody doing genetics today does that. They use living complex systems, and living complex systems cannot be stuffed into modern mechanical models. So we're already breaking out of it. So yes, I would want to gather the kinds of people, but I don't want to do it in defense of maybe we can keep modernity going. I want to do it in defense of let's pile up the data that's actual data out there. Let's pile up the data and make it easier to see that we're already leaking our way out of modernity. We, human beings, men, women, children, people at different ages, in a host of different ways, we're moving from piecemeal to relational understandings of reality and from static to dynamic understandings. And our indigenous cousins are saying, it took you long enough, white man. Welcome to where you should be. And if you want evidence of that, read David Peets. You may have known David, who was in Ottawa at the NRC, wrote the book Blackfoot Physics after conversations with Leroy Little Bear around Blackfoot understandings of reality. So you're in a right space there. It's not at all hopeless. It's not modernity has no future, but that doesn't mean we have. It's kind of like saying to an 8-year-old, you have no future as a child. Now, if at 8, if you actually said that to an 8-year-old, it would be cruel, because at 8, they understand how they'll be bigger, but they can't yet understand how they'll be different. And so don't do it to an 8-year-old, but it's phenomenologically true. They have no future as a child, with rare exceptions, that it's already built into their biology, that there will be brain changes and hormonal changes and structural changes in their body. So what I'm saying is the fact that modernity is disintegrating is one fact it's important. We shouldn't ignore it. We should learn not to put all our eggs in that basket, but we also have to learn that we're already in the process of nurturing a different sense of reality and how to respond to it. And that's showing up in complexity theory as well as in other places. Theology is being rethought in these terms. I mean, one of the interesting things is that CACOR could be there's nobody in Canada smart enough yet, smart in the sense of just, I don't mean smart intellectually, I mean insightful enough to say, God, that would really be interesting. Let's identify all the people in all the different fields, from education to theology to physics to complexity theory to raising children, because they're all there. The thing they agree on is that a better version of modernity won't do. And let's get them together in a conference to see and to talk to each other about where they agree with each other, where there are juicy issues they want to work on. That, it seems to me, is a conversation that I could get excited about. Does that help?
Yes, I think it's a question of where one puts the dividing line between, if you like, a reformation of modernity as opposed to something which is different than modernity. So, for example, you were using growth economics as one of the central criteria within MTI. that you had to have growth. You had to assume that economically your societies had to grow. But if you moved into a kind of a steady state economics, then perhaps in your definition, you're already moving out of the MTI culture. Whereas somebody else might say, well, no, you're still in it because you're relying on technologies or relying on some other characteristic which was in your definition. So it is helpful, and I'm understanding a little bit that it's a question of where you're putting the boundary lines between something new and emergent or something old which is dying. But it's all very helpful.
Okay, well, we'll leave it at that for now.
Okay, thank you very much. And Raymond Lurie, you are on deck, and Dave Doherty, you have the floor.
Well, thank you, Claude. Sadly, I'm here with my friend SARS-2. I think this question is related to both of the previous questions, and I actually need to preface it with this observation, personal it may be. It seems to me that the world is changing very quickly. We've never had 8.125 billion people on the planet before, and we've never had all the different technologies that we currently have before. So it shouldn't come as no surprise that many of the phenomena that we are facing as a result of these technologies, and the great number of us, are unprecedented. We've never seen them before, and it's impossible, perhaps, under our current MTI model, for us even to begin to understand what's going on around us. And perhaps this is why we constantly seem to have scientists being surprised by just how strong a particular storm gets, or how quickly some particular glacier is melting. So that said, here's my question. Do you think that the current crisis continues to evolve into previously unknown phenomena that make it fundamentally unresolvable except by ceasing to do many modern activities?
I think learning, I want to reinforce what your suggestion, that learning to cease to do many modern activities is absolutely critical. Back to my own example of becoming a married man, I had to learn to say to myself, yeah, you've had 22 years of doing this and you got to stop. Doesn't mean that I have an expectation, nor did Heather, God bless her, that it would stop overnight. But I had to undertake as a project learning to become something I wasn't yet. And not being clear, I mean, lots of ambiguity about what all that process was, but really clear from the tone of voice that being a male chauvinist pig is an unacceptable status. And so it's clear to me that it would help us if we got clearer about modernity and what defines it, and became, if we got clearer that we are actually modern people living in a modern form of civilization, and we understand in a sense what the core of that is and its implications, and we did that routinely. Now, it may well be that in 30 years, some of that, shows up in schools and curricula and other places, and people have learned to dance with it openly. At the moment, that's not something we do well, because we don't even have common understandings of, in other words, not even everybody on this call will have exactly the same understanding of what it means to be modern techno-industrial, because I haven't defined it in a technical way. That's a different talk. I gave it to Iris last week. It's up on their website if you want it. So yes, let's learn to stop. And in the process, as we reflect, I think we'll also find that there are things we want to learn to start. So in that sense, I want to go back to Mike Nickerson, where he talks about less stuff, more fun, because he's saying, let's stop something, start something else. And I want to say both of those. And so there are things we should start as well. And some of them will sound almost hackneyed. But one of them would be learn to take your whole person to every situation that you're in. Now that blows up modernity, because we all learn, whether in university as graduate students, that you can't be a graduate student in a university as a whole person, because part of the definition of being an acceptable academic is there certain parts of certain persons that you cannot take to the university. The university started overwhelmingly in churches, by churches. It's pretty hostile now to spirituality, and at least there's an agreement you can get along fine in virtually every field without talking about it. So why bring it up here? Don't. So all I'm saying is learning to be present yourself with greater integrity. And you see this in women, you see it in biopic people. I mean, you see it in lots of people who are asserting more of their identity. And it's not that we as modern males need to assert modern maleness. What we need to assert is that I'm a modern male who's learning to transcend my modern maleness. That's the message that some other modern males might say, now that's interesting. I'm trying to struggle with that too. Can we talk?
Well, that leads me to this observation, which you've probably heard in discussions among members of CACOR a number of times before in recent years, which is the old maxim taught to almost all of us in university, especially in grad school. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And I would say it's about time we learned that just because we measured it should not lead us to believe that we can actually manage it.
Well, absolutely. It's to learn that measurement and management, that's an extraordinarily modern insight. No Indigenous elder would do, they would not smile, because part of Indigenous ethics is to not put another person down, to respect them deeply. But inside, they're laughing their head off. I'm saying, hey, white man, we've known, our folks have known you're crazy for 500 years. The word went out that we're being invaded by people who are crazy. What they think reality is and how they behave in it. And so, yeah. But we need to be able to say that openly in situations, because we still live in a culture, particularly if there's a lot of males around, where if you hear that maxim said, you're supposed to kind of bow your head as if this is wisdom, rather than say, that's bullshit.
Yeah, some version of wisdom. Oh, thank you very much.
All bullshit when we hear it, and take the risks of not being invited back to the party.
Okay, thank you so much for that exchange. And Jeff Passmore, you are on deck, and Raymond, you have the floor.
Hi, Ruben. I think I'll have to re-listen to this to get the full gist of what you're saying. Very interesting. Now, like I wrote in my question there, many years ago, I decided that I had to focus on something. And the picture you showed of someone focusing on carbon emissions, that pretty well describes me. And the reality is that we all have limited amount of time, skill sets, and all that to do stuff, right? So what I'm looking at is finding some way to improve the situation, whatever that ends up meaning. So given that my focus has been on carbon emissions, do you think there's something else that I should be looking at focusing on instead?
To use the language that Claude introduced by referencing McLuhan, look at the field as well as the object. If your object is climate change, I celebrate folks who have, I'm only alive because some people have specialized. I have 5 stents in my heart. That technology didn't exist. If I had had a heart attack 10 years before I had it, I might have died. Happily, the Foothills Hospital in Calgary was the first in Canada to put in stent technology, and that's where I ended up. So I ended up in the good place. In our modern culture, I'm not despising a focus, a specialty focus. It's the exclusion of other things. Indigenous people focus they've got a general sense in which the field finally trumps the specificity. Keeping the field together and honoring it so that the people and the relationship to the earth, that's far more important than the fact that you're hungry, even the specificity of that. They're not going to despise the fact you're hungry, but they want to go about feeding you and doing that in a way that doesn't harm the field. And we've grown up in modernity with the illusion that we can dispense with the field. That even, as I mentioned, agriculture-based cultures, which is what we first developed after the Holocene, are systems thinkers. Whether you're dealing with ancient Egyptians or ancient Chinese or Aristotle or the Incas, they still think systems, and systems thinkers think of field as well as object. But modernity has been an exercise, almost as if we said, let's see how long it would take us if we learned to could we create a culture that you just have people are all specialized, there's no focus on field, we can ignore field because we've learned elegantly to dance together as specialists. And there'll be no specialists in the field. We'll just eventually get beyond that. And it's almost as if people in the 12th century said, God, that's a really interesting thought. Let's try that out. How long would it take us to get good at it? And what would it feel like? And would it finally be sustainable? And the answer seems to be, take us about 1,000 years. It feels kind of like modernity does, that there's no place you can be a whole person. You can take bits of yourself into different settings. And it turns out it's not sustainable because it doesn't even deal with the biophysical field, let alone the civilizational field. So it's that would be kind of where I would go. And then that opens a whole host of ways in which you can explore that. So, I mean, for example, give it two. The history of is in effect exploring the field. So the history of art is learning to look at specific objects, not just as objects in themselves, but to see the way that this particular object is reflecting a sensibility that's been emerging over what may be several dozen or 100 or even 1,000 years. Because you can't look at a single object as if in the history of art, just all by itself. You have to look at this object and its relationship to this before it and this around it and that before it, so that doing anything that is the history of is in fact field work. And the part of the tragedy today is you can get PhDs in philosophy, for God's sake, without really understanding the history of philosophy.
Okay, so I get the system thinking and all that, and you know, when I look at carbon emissions, what I see is a whole bunch of other ancillary benefits like reduction in particles that pollute and all that kind of stuff, and that has an impact on people's health outcomes and et cetera, right? But again, what I'm looking at is, you know, I only have so much time on my hands. Yeah. Is there something else I should focus on that would be better, or should I just continue the way I am right now?
I don't want to be heard as scolding in that sense. We as modern people, I say this as somebody shaped as a modern man, we all largely become what the culture asks us to become. Those of us who male become modern males. This is even true of the heads of oil companies. They are successful modern businessmen in the oil business who understand the details of that in a way that they can make it work. Any of us who know any degree of specialization in any field know how extraordinary, both complex and complicated it is, and therefore just to respect people who became what the culture asked them to become. It just we're in the process of learning, not just from women and blacks, but as modern men, that modern cultures have asked us to become something that is not enough to ensure the well-being of life on Earth, let alone human life on Earth, let alone the well-being of ourselves, our families, and grandchildren. And some of that is biophysical, and some of that is civilizational. And we have to hold those together. But we mustn't, discovering there's a sense in which it's not our fault that we're modern men and women and good at it. It's what happened to us. And so this is like no-fault insurance or no-fault divorce. We're going to get to the place where we realize we've kind of both made a mistake and get out of it as elegantly and peacefully as we can without beating the crap of each other or ourselves, but also using that as an opportunity to move beyond what we were. So it's not into self-justification. It's to recognize what we've become is insufficient. But there's a sense in which nobody told me nobody told me at 6 when I was first invited to learn to open doors for people who weren't my sister, for women who weren't my sister or my mother. So my sister and my mother are excluded, but for other women, I should be a little gentleman and open a door. And not the people who taught me or myself did they think they were actually training a future male chauvinist pig, but they were. Not their fault. They were just helping me learn some manners.
Well, I think that the example I use on that often is, people in the oil sector in Alberta that, when they were kids, the job that you got that would pay you well to feed your family, which is important to everybody, was in the oil sector. So that's what you did. You didn't intentionally try to make the world a worse place, right? So yeah, I see your point. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you.
We're nearing the end of our time, and Ted Manning will be on deck to give our official thanks. And Jeff, you have the floor.
Yeah, thanks, Claude. Thanks, Ruben. Lots of comments one could make. Actually, I've always been accused of speaking my mind to the point where I had a birthday a couple of weeks ago, and one of the best toasts at the wedding, at the birthday was my longtime friend of 50 years who said, "Jeff and I have known each other for so long, nobody wants to speak to us anymore." So that was the best toast I've ever had. Listen, you can see my comments. I was really privileged to take a course in general semantics in the mid-1970s, where we learned that the word is not the thing, and what is going on does not necessarily coincide with what it means to humans, and lovely questions like that you've raised today. I just want to explore a little further a comment you made half an hour ago, where you said, this is not a problem that can be solved. It seems to me you've posed the polycrisis problem, and you indeed have suggested solutions such as cease doing modern activities, nurture a different sense of reality. We need to give up our mindset, change our character, change our culture. So I think, you've identified a problem. I've had many of my friends talk about the polycrisis, and I think you're right in terms of the solution, that it requires a cultural change, and we've got a lot to learn from First Nations.
Yeah, I guess what I don't hear you picking a quarrel with me.
No, I'm not.
I hear you saying this is how I hear what you said, and I honor that you hear it that way. I find it more helpful to remind myself, since the meta project is to outgrow my own modernity and to help our culture outgrow its modernity, to not see our modernity as a problem to solve, but to see it as a condition to be explored, understood, worked with. And so I try to work with it in a sense as a good psychologist would work with a client. Good psychologists don't see their clients as problems. They see them as human beings with particular conditions, and what they're trying to do is relate to them in ways that the client can understand the condition and find ways to work with it themselves, so that over time the client is better able to understand themselves, their condition, and get somewhere with it.
And well, that's a nice way to think about it. That's a nice way to think about it. I know we're running out of time, so.
Yeah, well, and I need to just acknowledge, at one point, I'm the only Canadian who has been elected the president of the Association for Humanistic Psychology, and I'm the only non-psychologist. I mean, they broke, and they needed me as president because they were in organizational crisis, and they knew that I could handle organizational crises. So that's why I became. But it does mean that I've learned an immense amount from some extraordinarily wise and kind friends who are extraordinary humanistic psychologists to shed light on the situation we're in and how to make sense of it and act within it. So your question is very helpful. Thank you.
Ted.
Ruben, one of my favorite people, and one of the people I enjoy arguing with most, because that was very stimulating. I think you got a lot of people thinking. There's a couple of questions behind all of this that I'm not sure we've addressed yet. One is, what do we really want as a future? That we certainly are distressed with what's happening now, but I have not really heard very much about, in that case, what were we able to change? What would we change to? And we have, obviously, you have noted a lot of different cultures and approaches who may have different ideas. And I guess it's probably not a bad idea to consider them and be open to them. The second question I had was, everybody has different assumptions, and they very seldom address them before they start talking. And yet anything we do is within our own set of assumptions of what we think it is, what it works, where we're going, and so forth. I think it's very important, if we have dialogues on this, that we actually see if we have shared assumptions regarding how society works, regarding how the economy works, regarding the environment and our place in it. And the third thing is, can we model this in any way that's useful? And is modernity a factor in that? And I don't expect an answer now, but I think the next time we have one of these, perhaps we can have a reasonable discussion on where next. So that's a bit of a challenge to all of us. So I'll thank you again for get you here again in future, and we'll revisit this, and maybe even, I don't know, are there solutions? Maybe there aren't. So thank you ever so much. Just say to everybody that this is going to be on the web very shortly. Please look at the CanadianCore.com. If you wish to belong and you are not, please join us. After all, you're doing very interesting and stimulating people in front of you every week or so. So again, please enjoy. And it's just telling me my internet connection is unstable. I hope you can hear me. I'm unstable too, but that's just one of my assumptions. So the answer is, please, when you go to the YouTube, hit on subscribe, because that gives us a reasonable list of who is actually watching and how big we get. And sometimes we get an incredible response. So thank you all very much. And we're now going to turn on, you can turn on your